Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's July 12th, 2025, and the topics that are not off limits here are not limited to just things that are politically incorrect or inconvenient or taboo in the traditional understanding of that word, but topics that, to use the in vogue, pretentious, artsy description, meet at the intersection of two nerd topics, and that is the Final Fantasy Japanese role-playing game series and Magic the Gathering, the collectible trading card game. Hasbro, the parent company of Wizards of the Coast, which is the company that makes Magic the Gathering, recently released a Magic the Gathering card set using the Final Fantasy's IP. And I'll be offering a review of how that was pulled off. It will be non-exhaustive, definitionally, because I am familiar with Final Fantasy IV, which was originally released as Final Fantasy II in the United States, and Final Fantasy VI, which was originally released as Final Fantasy III. I also have a passing familiarity with Final Fantasy I, 7, 9, and 10. Those are all titles that I have played, but it's been decades since I've done so, and that is also the case with Final Fantasy IV and 6, but a more significant portion of my childhood and early adolescence was devoted to playing through those two games again and again and again. The primary focus will be on how the story and characters and events in the games were captured in the cards. But I intend to digress into commentary on the stories and the characters and how they sit and what they may have to say about the contemporary cultural environment. The set covered games 1 through 15, and as mentioned, more than half of those I have zero familiarity with and will therefore not be commenting at all on. And even within the games that I have played, it will be non-exhaustive. I'm going to pick out particular cards and characters and storylines that I find something in the old brain cage worth talking about. We'll start with Final Fantasy I, originally released on the 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System, and so limited very much in terms of storytelling and gameplay and character development. And the only card I want to mention here is the main antagonist of the game, a character named Garland. He is in Rakdos colors, red and black, which, briefly for the non-nerds out there, Magic has 5 colors, and each color has a set of personality traits, philosophies, and approaches that map onto a lot of different dimensions of human emotions and human tendencies. Most cards are in a single color, but there are cards that are in multiple colors, and there are also cards that have no color at all. In the case of Garland, being Rakdos, red and black, red is the color of chaos and impulsivity, and black is the color of death and darkness, and that will be a theme that's recurring in this set, where the bad guys, as it were, in the Final Fantasy titles tend towards black and red, and in particular Rakdos, that color combination of black and red together. It is especially fitting in Garland, Knight of Cornelia's case, that he is Rakdos, since his lore is that he cannot ever fully die. When he dies in his knight form, he becomes a demon named Chaos, fittingly enough, given that he is Rakdos. And that is captured cleverly in the card, which for a steep price of 3 colorless, 2 black, and 2 red, Garland, Knight of Cornelia, can be returned from the graveyard to the battlefield transformed as a 5/5 flying demon with the ability that when Chaos dies, put it on the bottom of its owner's library. In Magic, when creatures die, they go to the graveyard, and so they aren't able to be drawn and played again. And so the spin on Garland is that he has that ability to be played from the graveyard, and then as he returns as Chaos the Endless, the 5/5 flying demon, when he dies in that form, he goes to the bottom of the owner's library and then can be shuffled in and drawn again, and so the cycle theoretically continues indefinitely. There are ways, without getting too much on a digression, but it's much more difficult to get him out of the game completely because he just dies and flips back and flips back. On now to Final Fantasy IV, and my favorite card from the Universes Beyond release, Cecil Dark Knight. This is one they really hit out of the park. Cecil Dark Knight is a single black mana for a 2/3, which makes him an absolute rate monster. In Magic, the first number is the power and the second number is the toughness. One of the challenges to taking a JRPG series like Final Fantasy and converting it to static card form is capturing the leveling up nature of Final Fantasy games. At the beginning of the game, you're doing 50 hit points of damage, and by the end of the game, you're doing 5,000, which is quite an explosion in the physical strength of the character over the course of a journey that takes place over months, maybe a couple of years. That is the equivalent, if those numbers are looked at on a linear scale, of a person being able to bench 50 pounds when he starts the adventure and then bench press 5,000 pounds by the end. And yes, of course, we're in the realm of fantasy here, so nothing has to really hew closely to the empirical realities of mundania of us here on Earth. But a 100 times explosion in physical strength is not to be taken literally. Of course, the characters, as the stories progress, become more skilled and stronger and acquire new techniques and weapons, but the idea is that they become better, like an athlete becomes better as they move through their career, not that they are able to jump 1 foot when they start and then they have a 100-foot vertical 2 years later. But in Magic, the mana resource system is one that does not lend itself to having all of the primary characters presented in their ultimate form, because they would all have prohibitively high casting costs, and so there would be no early game for the curve to work on. Cecil, as a Dark Knight in particular, is one of the most physically robust characters in the Final Fantasy series across any of the games. And yet Tella, the great sage, Old Man Tella, the one who strikes physically and impotently with a rod in the game and misses more often than he makes contact, and if he does make contact, it is a trivial amount of damage that is done. He is presented on his eponymous card as a 3/3, 3 power and 3 toughness, and so just looking at the base stats, it looks like Tella the Great Sage is a little bit stronger and as equally robust as Cecil is. And of course, Tella is geriatric, and though he is a powerful magic user, he has no physical prowess. If he ever did, he certainly doesn't at the octogenarian stage that we meet him in the game. And yet this juxtaposition works perfectly because Cecil only costs 1 total mana, whereas Tella the Great Sage costs 5. He's an Izzet, 3 colorless, 1 blue, 1 red. And so effectively what is being represented is Cecil in the early part of the story and Tella near the end of the story. In a basic game of Magic, the player is able to play a single mana source per turn, and so over the course of the game, more and more mana is available to cast more powerful cards, but each mana can only be used once a turn, and so the expensive to cast cards are effectively useless in the early turns of the game, and those early turns can oftentimes be the turns that contain the entirety of any given game, and so those more expensive cards to cast rot in the player's hand and never actually hit the battlefield and see any action. That resource balance and deployment is a crucial element of what makes the game so complex and skill testing. From 1 mana to 2, there is generally a doubling of power and toughness, and it increases as casting cost increases. The biggest jump is from 1 mana to 2, and the rate of increase trails off over time, but as a rough approximation, the average increase from each subsequent amount of mana required to cast a spell is about 50%. And so if we take Cecil the Dark Knight as a 2/3 for 1 mana and compare it to Tella the Great Sage, a 3/3 for 5 mana, we get the 5 converted mana cost version of Cecil as an 8/12 compared to Tella as a 3/3, which seems just about exactly correct. In addition to being a 2/3, Cecil also has Death Touch, which means whenever he does combat damage to anything else, he kills those things that he does damage to. But this Dark Strength is not without a trade-off. He has an ability called Darkness, which says whenever Cecil deals damage, you lose that much life. Though it wasn't part of the original American Super Nintendo release, in the initial Japanese version, Cecil had an ability where he could hit multiple enemies on the screen, but he would drain him in the process, and this Death Touch paired with Darkness is the perfect encapsulation of that on a Magic card. And additionally, if that loss of life causes a player's to drop below half of the player's starting life total, Cecil transforms from Cecil Dark Knight to Cecil Redeemed Paladin, and he becomes a 4/4 lifelink with the ability Protect, which reads whenever Cecil attacks, other attacking creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. In Final Fantasy IV, Cecil as a Dark Knight has to go and atone for the dark deeds he's done and repent and be transformed from a Dark Knight into a Paladin, and for that transformation to occur, he has to go through a period where he does not fight, he just takes damage from aggressor to protector, from predator to shepherd. Cecil Dark Knight is a black card, but when he flips to Cecil Redeemed Paladin, he becomes a white creature, and black, as aforementioned, is the color of death and darkness, while white is the color of order and light. And he goes from harming everyone to being able to protect everyone by giving them indestructibility. In addition to casting cost and the corresponding rate, paralleling the grinding, leveling up experience of the set also has a clever treatment of tiered spells that are a recurring feature of Final Fantasy games. For example, the card Ice Magic is an instant for 1 colorless and a blue that is tiered. Tiered allows the player to choose 1 additional cost when casting the spell. And the first one requires no additional mana. It's Blizzard. The next one requires 2 additional colorless for Blizzara, and the final version requires 5 additional colorless and 1 more blue for Blizzaga. And as more mana is used to cast the spells, they have more powerful iterations of what that first lowest tier effect is. Just as the stronger versions of the spells require more MP, so do the stronger versions of the Magic card game spells require more mana to cast. Rydia, Summoner of Mist, is a Gruul creature, so 1 red, 1 green. Green being the color of life and organicness. Has an ability entitled Summon that allows her to return a saga card from a graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. One of the challenges of bringing 15 titles to a single card set is that a class like Summoner is a recurring theme that many protagonists across the series are presented as. And so how do you differentiate Rydia from Terra in Final Fantasy VI, from Garnet in Final Fantasy IX, and from Yuna in Final Fantasy X without making the same card over and over again with slight variation? Part of the way is by presenting them at different parts of the mana curve, getting back to what we talked about with Cecil as a 1 mana drop and Tella as a 5 mana drop creature. But there really isn't a big difference in what Rydia does compared to what Yuna from Final Fantasy X does. Reflecting on the story of Final Fantasy IV, Rydia is a child summoner who is orphaned and falls into the hands of those who murder her mom in front of her. And one of the ones who murders the mother is none other than Cecil, the main protagonist of the story. That's heavy stuff for elementary school kids to be dealing with. And if that wasn't challenging enough, Edge, another character from Final Fantasy IV that does not get any treatment in this. And this set has been extremely successful. The pre-orders before the set was even released outdid the total sales of any other set that Wizards of the Coast had ever released, and there are over 100 of them in the 30-plus-year-old game's history. And this set was a few hundred cards to cover 15 titles. Given the success and the depth of the games, it could easily be, each game could easily be given its own special set treatment. And if that happened, Edge would be represented, but as is the case, to provide a mix of protagonists and antagonists, and then also things that aren't creatures but are nods to things that occur and spells and places and all of the other things that make a magic set, limited Wizards of the Coast to giving card treatments to between 4 and 8 protagonists and about half that many antagonists from each game. And so Edge didn't make the cut in Final Fantasy IV. It was Cecil, Rydia, Rosa, Kain, and Tella. But if having to ally up with the killers of your mother isn't enough of a Freudian nightmare, Edge is forced to kill his parents by his own hand because they had become mad, demonic, infected, and were trying to kill him. Rosa, Resolute White Mage, is a white creature with reach, the ability to block flying creatures, a nod to her weapon of choice, the bow and arrow, with an ability to, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains lifelink until end of turn. She plays the ultimate support role here as a card. And that is a perfectly fitting treatment for the character who is arguably the most feminine in Final Fantasy. She defers to Cecil time and time again, and only when the situation is especially desperate, when the party needs to take the lunar whale to go to the moon to fight the lunar denizens of that foreign planet, does she finally refuse his counsel and sneak aboard the shuttle to join him on his trip to the moon. And while that might read as some sort of triumphant moment for feminists in video game storytelling, the reality is a society that sends its most fertile and fecund women to die in battle is a society that is in desperate straits. And even though she joins the battle, she is always in the back row, so that Cecil and Kain and Edge, other members of the party, are in the front line of the phalanx, as it were, and absorb the lion's share of the physical damage while she provides cover and support from the back. And if you're a male feminist who claims that you put her in the front row, you are being called out on your BS here. You're lying. That's not something you could have done because, unlike Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy IV, in the very essence of the characters that make up the story, deeply incorporates the realities of human biodiversity. The characters are not fungible, not even close. They have different abilities, different strengths and weaknesses. And as the last decade of gender bender insanity in the real world, where men pretending to be women are able to compete against those women as if they are biologically equal, has forced us to confront firsthand, when it comes to physical prowess, men are much physically stronger and more physically durable than women, and men particularly in their 20s and 30s, more so than prepubescent boys or men sliding towards senescence. And one of the ways that high fantasy deals with this to still provide playable female characters is to give them abilities like magic and provides them with better agility statistics, which is a bit of a sleight of hand because women tend to be more flexible than men, but not faster. They don't have greater celerity in movement. In general, men tend to be faster and quicker. But through agility and magic, stories that respect human biodiversity are able to slot in female characters as capable martial party members. As the series became more popular in the 90s and became more of an international phenomenon rather than a indigenous Japanese cultural production to be exported to other countries, there was presumably pressure from the culturally imperialistic West to provide the feminist demanded butt-kicking babe character who would show up as Celis in Final Fantasy VI, who was an imperial knight and a warrior, and even more so in Final Fantasy VII with Tifa, who was a martial artist, and then in 9 with Beatrix, who is a more capable physical warrior than even Aldebert Steiner, who is the tank of the playable protagonist characters and looks like a Hulk of a man. In his visual representations, he was smitten and outsorted by Beatrix. Although that might be a little weebish of me to let the Japanese off the hook, as Dragon Quest IV had a character, Alina, who was a warrior princess and physically the strongest character without any equipment in the equation, just based on physical statistics, was the strongest physical character in the game, and that was released years before Final Fantasy IV. It was on the 8-bit, and it wasn't nearly as popular outside of Japan as it was inside of Japan. Anyway, back to Rosa. She is depicted repeatedly offering comfort and support to Cecil, who is, as the indispensable alpha, is preoccupied with his own projects. He has love and affection for her, but his focus is on the mission. And she's into Cecil because he's into said mission. Kain, in contrast, is into her, and so she is not into the mission. Kain, in contrast to the alpha Cecil, is quite the gamma character. To put it crassly, Kain is a great illustration of the rose before hose adage. He's a capable warrior, but he has a mercenary spirit. He lacks intrinsic internal locus of control. And though Kain does have a redemptive story arc, the treatment he gets in this set zeroes in on his Judas Iscariot nature. Kain, Traitorous Dragoon, is a black creature, exclusively a black creature, who whenever he deals combat damage to a player, that player gains control of him. For flavor, he also has a static ability, Jump, that gives him flying during your turn, which makes it easy for him to switch sides. And the choice of the word traitorous, that adjective, is interesting here. In the story itself, of course, Kain works for the Baron Castle Imperial system. He is a dragoon in Baron's army, and he is sent on a mission that Cecil defects from, but that Kain is a little bit coy about his feelings one way or the other, doesn't actually, if I recall correctly, explicitly abandon the kingdom of Baron as Cecil does. And so in some ways, from a military perspective, Cecil is the traitor, not Kain, but it is more complicated than that, of course, because Baron has the monarchy in Baron has been surreptitiously usurped by one of the 4 elemental fiends, and so it's not actually the rightful king of Baron who is issuing the orders that Cecil finds increasingly impossible to abide, while Kain, driven more by the power of the kingdom and by the desire to one-up Cecil so that he can be the object of Rosa's desire rather than Cecil, maintains that mercenary loyalty to the evil kingdom. But even that loyalty, such as it is tentative, as he eventually does join Cecil, albeit for mixed motives. An interesting aside, folk wisdom in Japan views those who are left-handed as more susceptible to corruption and nefarious activities. And the characters in Final Fantasy IV have handedness. They equip weapons in their dominant hand and shields in their non-dominant hands. And all of the characters in the game are right-handed, save for Kain, who is a lefty. The aforementioned Tella is an Is-It character, so he is 3 colorless, a blue and a red. Blue, the last of the 5 colors we've yet to give a brief description of, is the color of artificiality and deliberation. A brief aside on the magic color pie. There are 5 colors. Each color has 2 allied colors and 2 enemy colors. And of the 2 major descriptors of each color, one corresponds to the opposition of one of the enemy colors, and the other descriptor corresponds to the oppositional force of the other enemy color. And so in the case of white, which is the color of order and light, white's enemy colors are red and black, and red's opposition to white's order comes in the form of chaos, while black's opposition to white's light comes in the form of darkness. Blue's artificiality contrasts with green's organicness, blue's deliberation with red's impulsivity, black's death with green's life. But there are enemy color combinations in single cards. In the early years of Magic, that was exceedingly uncommon, but now it is almost as common, if not as common, as allied color pairs. But there is an inherent tension when enemy colors are combined together. And in the case of Tella, who is Is-It, which is blue and red, the fault line of tension there between red and blue is red's impulsivity and blue's deliberation. And that is a perfect color pie depiction of Tella, who is a studied, knowledgeable, powerful, great sage, but who also flies off the handle, particularly with regards to his daughter and his overprotective nature of her. When non-creature spells are cast, Tella provides benefits that scale up the more mana spent to cast those non-creature spells. If 8 or more mana was spent to cast a spell, sacrifice Tella and it deals that much damage to each opponent. 8 mana is a lot. In many games, it is prohibitively expensive. When that much mana is spent to cast a spell, it's going to have a powerful effect, but it is going to put so much stress on the caster that it might just kill him, like, say, Meteor does in the game. Tella, like Cecil, is a fantastic flavor treatment. Gyat, King of the Dwarves, in contrast, is not. And disappointingly, in the flavor text of the card, and in Magic there are italics on cards that have enough space to provide flavor text that is entirely irrelevant to gameplay. Magic is often conflated with games like Dungeons and Dragons for the non-nerds of the world. But that's not a very apt description. Magic is not a narrative game with a dungeon master who is coming up with the storyline as the other people progress through an ever-changing adventure. Magic is more akin to poker, like a very advanced form of poker with strict rules that govern every single action and interaction in the game. There is nothing subjective. There is nothing left to interpretation or artistic license. And so when I talk about the flavor of Cecil and Tella, that is flavor, and probably not the optimal word to use here, but in the vernacular, it gets the point across. The flavor I'm referring to, and it's not an optimal word choice probably with regards to the video game characters, is in reference to their card game mechanics that are very relevant to gameplay. But in Magic cards, at the bottom in italics, if space provides, there is flavor text that is there just to give flavor for entertainment purposes, such that Magic doesn't play out, even though the rules governing it are as strict as those governing poker or chess. There is a less sterile, dry, entirely cerebral aspect of the game that gives it its flavor. And for Gyat, king of the dwarves, it's, quote, "We will fight along with you for the planet, our home," unquote. That there is no nod to Lally-Ho is a real letdown. On to Final Fantasy VI, Magitech Armor. It's an artifact vehicle that when it enters, you create a 1/1 colorless hero creature token. It's a 4/4 with crew 1. This is a nod to the mechanized armored vehicle of the Empire that Terra, Vix, and Wedge take to their assault on Narsh to get Terra in contact with the frozen Esper being hidden there. Crew 1, to activate the equipment in Magic, requires the lowest level of power to commandeer. And so we see here that even not especially talented or industrious soldiers like Vix and Wedge are able to become quite powerful utilizing the Magitech armor. Perhaps Cyan would have been a notable exception in being unable to utilize the Magitech armor by crewing it, but he was one of the casualties that did not survive the cutting room floor in this set. Speaking of Narsh, Moogle's Valor is a white instant card. For each creature you control, create a 1/2 Moogle creature token with lifelink. Then creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. And in case that wasn't obvious enough, a tribute to the Moogles helping Locke defend the Esper and Terra, the flavor text is, quote, "Thanks, Moogles, we're in your debt," unquote. Locke Cole. Speaking of Locke, he gets 2 treatments, one in the main set and one in a Commander non-standard legal special release. The main set, Locke Cole, is in Dimir, so he's black and blue, the colors that don't really get at his essence. Dak Faden is a planeswalker who steals things, steals artifacts in particular, and he is in the Izzet colors, so perhaps a nod to Izzet would make more sense. But in addition to being Dimir, he also has Death Touch and Lifelink. And so a character clearly designed for the limited set environment, limited gameplay set environment, and tribute to the video game itself, an afterthought to be generous. He does loot, that is, allows the player to draw a card and then discard a card when he deals combat damage to an opponent, but that's as far as the Dimir signpost gets to capturing Locke's essence. Locke Treasure Hunter, in contrast, though he's in Rakdos colors, implying strongly that his protestations aside, he is in fact a thief rather than a treasure hunter, even though his name is Locke Treasure Hunter, has the Mug ability, which is a literal porting of his ability in the game to attack and steal from an opponent in so doing. The Mug ability reads that whenever Locke attacks, each player mills a card. If a land card was milled this way, create a treasure token. Until end of turn, you may cast a spell from among those cards. This is a truer capturing of Locke's essence. It's too bad that it wasn't in the main set. Phoenix Down is an artifact that can be sacrificed to return a creature with casting cost 4 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield, but it comes in tapped, which is a subtle allusion to the fact that in gameplay, Phoenix Down does revive dead characters, but it brings them back in a compromised state, and so they come into play tapped rather than come into play untapped and ready to do combat. In the game, they come back weakened. They're alive, but not anywhere close to maximum hit points. And in an even subtler nod to gameplay, an alternate condition for exiling Phoenix Down, activating it, instead of returning a creature from the graveyard, a player can also elect instead to exile target skeleton, spirit, or zombie. The undead is a recurring theme in Final Fantasy series, and items that mend the living, of course, make them better off, but these same items and spells correspondingly do damage to the undead. And so the down, that is the feathers of the phoenix, which is the legendary bird that rises from the ashes and grants renewal and revival to the living, correspondingly destroys the undead. Edgar, King of Figaro. When he enters, you draw a card for each artifact you control. And as the steampunk artificer turned reluctant monarch, who engineers his own weapons, and whose in-game utility is significantly assessed by the number of said artifacts that he has engineered, this is fitting. He also has a seemingly throwaway ability called Two-Headed Coin that reads, the first time you flip one or more coins each turn, those coins come up heads and you win those flips. Recall that blue, which is the color that Edgar is represented as exclusively here, is the color of artifice and deliberation. And he, perhaps more than any other character in the series, is the one I've had the greatest epiphany on over the years since first encountering these games as a kid. He is remembered as a lech and a joker, but his duty and his emotional maturity are in stark contrast to Sabin, who was always my favorite character. And I think in a lot of ways, Sabin's physical prowess and fearlessness and desire to master hand-to-hand combat appeals to prepubescent boys struggling to find their way in the world. They chafe at the idea of duty and responsibility and instead want to go do badass wilderness training on a mountain with a martial arts leader. Or at least that idea has a lot of purchase with their imaginations. But though Edgar is womanizer who exploits a great power differential that he enjoys over his subjects as king of Figaro Castle, it's made clear that his putative attempts at seduction are never realized. They are never met with actionable responses from the women involved, and given the dynamics of human nature and the desire and the attraction that women have for fame and for power, and anyone who balks at that need look no farther than the outpouring of love letters and desires for a conjugal visit that famous serial killers receive from women all over the world who know only of them from their fame, know nothing of them on a personal level, or look at how women react to celebrities. The musician groupie phenomenon. In Henry Kissinger's words, and he was not an especially attractive physical specimen, but who was a known and successful philanderer, power is an aphrodisiac. And so if Edgar wanted to exploit these people for his own hedonistic ends, he could do so, but it's made clear that he doesn't act on those things, and that it is in fact a persona that he puts forward to grease the wheels in his relationship with the Empire, a relationship he does not find desirable, one he is attempting to extricate himself and his kingdom from when we meet him in the story, but who, given the power dynamics at the time, is unable to do so in good conscience as a steward of his people. He's not trying to one-up the Empire by getting Terra to come over to the resistance side, the returner side. No, he just wants after her because she's an attractive co-ed of freshman college age. And when Kefka comes knocking, he is able to play dumb or play snoo numb on account of having so many women on his mind that he would put Don Henley to shame. When Terra asks, "Look, why are you helping me? Is it because of my abilities?" Edgar responds, "I'll give you 3 reasons. First of all, your beauty has captivated me. Second, I'm dying to know if I'm your type. I guess your abilities would be a distant third." Edgar doesn't want to exploit people, certainly not for his own subjective benefit. As mentioned previously, he was a reluctant king. He let Sabine make the choice, but knew, because he's so much better at reading people's emotions than Sabine, even though he, presumably, as the artificer and tinkerer with machines, would be the one, we would say, in contemporary parlance, be more likely to be on the spectrum and therefore have more trouble reading people's emotions than someone like Sabine, who is so in tune with his physical nature. Yet in one of the flashbacks we're treated to, we see that Edgar realizes that their father, is dying, surreptitiously poisoned by the Empire, and Sabine is clueless. He comes and naively asks Edgar why everyone is talking about their father. And Edgar, who, again, despite being portrayed as a sort of lech and womanizer, sort of Angelo-type character from Dragon Quest VIII, is actually much more of a stoic than really any other character in the game. Certainly more so than Sabine, who it is a kind of a running joke throughout that this presumably disciplined martial artist is the one who emotionally flies off the handle repeatedly. But Edgar, even as the greatest stoic, is still not a perfect stoic, and so he leaves Sabine in a rush because he cannot contain his tears, because he has ascertained what Sabine could not, which is that their father is dying. Brought to my mind the powerful scene in the movie First Man, where Neil Armstrong, played by Ryan Gosling, breaks down in private at the funeral for his toddler daughter, and also Maximus in Gladiator, when his erstwhile servant brings him the figurines of his wife and son. Powerful moments, all 3. They get me choked up. And then in the world of Ruin, while Sabine is nobly enough going around from place to place, engaging in acts of charity for the put upon and often destitute survivors of the world of Ruin, we meet Edgar disguised as Gerard, an anagram of Edgar, going incognito in an attempt to access Figaro and by extension access an airship so that he is able to take the fight to Kefka. A less glamorous and outwardly laudatory pursuit, but one that is ultimately far more efficacious in taking the necessary steps to rectify the situation. 5 protagonists in Final Fantasy VI get treatment in this magic set. I've talked about Locke and Edgar, and I will talk about Celes and Terra. The 5th one, though, is seemingly going to come out of left field, but I think there is a rather depressing explanation. That 5th character is Gogo, the mimic that is an optional character with very little relevance, if any, to the story being told. That is because Gogo famously is introduced to us thus: shrouded in odd clothing. Is this a man? A woman? Or should we ask? And while that might register as some sort of transphobic hate crime in the current year, the inclusion of a they is exactly the kind of thing that a woke corporation like Hasbro is eager to oblige. A Hasbro that, for reasons utterly divorced from gameplay considerations, banned cards like Crusade from all formats, even though there are cards that are strictly better than Crusade, like Honor of the Pure, that remain legal. Gogo is a blue creature with clone ability, so that at least is respectful of the character's in-game attributes. Terra, magical adept, is a red and green creature, so a Gruul creature, rather than being Esper colored, even though she is literally an Esper. And for non-magic nerds, Esper is the 3-way color combination between black, white, and blue. She does have a trance ability where she goes from being a 4-power, 2-toughness creature without flying to a 6/6 creature with flying. though when she goes into the trance, she is not required to attack, which seems like a bit of a flavor miss. Nowhere near as much of a miss as Celis, Ruin, and Night is, however. She is a Mardu creature that is red, white, and black, with a neat set of Mardu abilities, but abilities that have absolutely nothing to do with her character in the game. And this is especially disappointing because her Runic ability is quite unique, unlike summoners and mages and artificers who are a dime a dozen. Her Runic ability allows her to absorb magic, and so she would be perfectly positioned to have some variation of a Spellskite ability. Spellskite is a creature with the activated ability to change a target spell or ability to Spellskite. And the design space around that ability is one that has not been explored very much and wasn't explored at all in this Final Fantasy set release, and Celis would have been the perfect character to have done that through. But I suppose it is in some ways fitting to have throwaway design spent on Final Fantasy VI characters rather than Final Fantasy IV, since, as mentioned previously, while Final Fantasy IV adheres to the realities of human biodiversity, particularly as they regard the sexes, Final Fantasy VI departs from that almost entirely, with some exceptions for storyline purposes. For example, Celeste, whose nurture had been from the beginning one of martial prowess and cold-blooded warrior ethos, clearly gets into and enjoys playing the, quote, opera floozy, unquote. And Terra, whose nature is quite a Pandora's box, only being half human, although the lore has it that the Espers were at some point human, much like in Lord of the Rings, that Smeagol isn't some sort of reptilian goblin creature, he is a hobbit. But in any case, despite her complicated backstory and upbringing, she is still strongly pulled by a maternal instinct in the world of Ruin when the budding party is reconstituting itself. She has lost her willingness to fight and instead wants only to be a mother to orphaned children. But despite a few of those subversive deviations, the male and female characters are effectively interchangeable in gameplay. Though Realm and Strago are not given cameo characters, the set does include a spell called Realm Sketching, which creates a copy of an artifact, creature, or land, a nod to her ability to capture things so well that they seem lifelike, or even become lifelike in the case of the demon thing that inhabits her portrait of the wealthy man in Jador, Alzur, I believe, if memory serves. Interestingly, too, Jador is a blue land, and in addition to being the color of deliberation and artificiality, blue also tends to be the color of neutrality. While Vector, the imperial capital, is a black and red, a Rakdos producing land. Hilgaigish, the obnoxiously iconic random encounter from Zozo, gets its own card as a red land cycler, seeing that image brought back that groan test emotion I regularly experienced as a kid when encountering one of these giants who counterattacked with magnitude 8, hurting the entire party. And though Edgar gets special treatment, Sabin does not. As discussed previously, that is an understandable decision, as Edgar is a more multifaceted, interesting character. But Sabin does get representation in the artwork on the card Suplex, which is an Abrade variation that either deals 3 damage to target creature or exiles target artifact. And the artwork is from behind Sabin, claws drawn out like Wolverine, running towards an oncoming train. The Phantom Train also gets treatment as a black artifact vehicle card that is a quite difficult threat to deal with, to get off the board, but one particularly good answer for it in the set is, fittingly enough, suplex. And for non-Final Fantasy nerds, look up video for Sabin, which is spelled like cabin, but with an S, or perhaps Sabin if you prefer. Sabin suplex Phantom Train. And this reference will make sense to you, and you will also have additional fodder with which to mock and belittle Final Fantasy nerds like yours truly. Poison the Waters is a black sorcery that the artwork depicts Kefka poisoning the river system in Doma, a war crime that, while it does effectively end the siege of Doma in victory for the Empire, presumably also kills a lot of Imperial soldiers who are camped just outside of Doma, laying siege to it, and would presumably be drawing from the same water supply that the inhabitants of the castle are drawing from. And the horror that Cyan experiences as a samurai and as a retainer of the kingdom and protector of his family, who has really, through no conceivable fault of his own, failed at that duty, offers a nuanced perspective towards technological progress. Almost invariably, as technology progresses, correspondingly and inversely, notions of honor and chivalry yield to notions of efficiency and utilitarianism. Through Kefka, the Empire drops the nuclear bomb on Doma, but at what cost? Speaking of Kefka, Court Mage, is in Grixis colors, so blue, black, and red, with the ability to cause players to discard and then for you to draw. And discarding in Magic is a mechanic meant to signify the losing of one's mind, while drawing cards is increasing one's knowledge. And so Kefka is effectively sending others into madness and descending into madness himself, but at the same time gaining knowledge and power through the process. And on his flip side, where he transforms into Kefka, Ruler of Ruin, the flavor text encapsulates his manifestation of nihilism personified. Quote, life, dreams, hope, where do they come from, and where do they go? Such meaningless things, I'll destroy them all. Moving briefly now through 7, 9, and 10, starting with Final Fantasy VII, we have Aerith Gainsborough, a white creature who, when she dies, her counters are moved to other legendary creatures, and as mentioned previously, I am quite hazy on the details of all but Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI, and so when I claim bona fides as a Final Fantasy nerd, that is hyperbolic. And though I've told myself a million times not to exaggerate, here I am. But Aerith is the tragic figure who dies and who is the motivation for Cloud, the main protagonist, to take down Shinra and revive Captain Planet. The aforementioned Cloud tutors up an equipment, and at least in the limited environment, the equipment hoped to be tutored up for is the Buster Sword, which is the most powerful piece of equipment in the set. The set introduced summons, which are variations of sagas. They are creature sagas in essence, and they have chapters, just as sagas do, where each turn they acquire an additional lore counter, and when they have received a lore counter for each chapter, they disappear from play. Most of the summons have 3 chapters, a few have 4, and exactly one has 5, and the one that has 5 is Summon Knights of the Round, and that is a humorous nod to how exceedingly long the animation for the Knights of the Round summon in the Final Fantasy VII video game takes. Sephiroth, Fabled Soldier, is an aristocrat, blood artist type of variation that becomes stronger as he exploits others, and if enough are exploited in battle or otherwise, he transforms into Sephiroth, One-Winged Angel. and he is a black card, but Barrett Wallace is a red card. And while, of course, WotC wouldn't dare do something as transgressive as make Barrett black, it is the correct decision, given that red, again, is the color of impulsivity and chaos, but not of death and darkness, which black is. Somewhat subversively, I guess, Barrett's just not a very good card, which is a bit of a shame since he is a type of unicorn, a black environmentalist, and one who is member to, if not the founder of, an eco-terrorist group known as Avalanche, because Mudslide would be in poor taste. Moving to Final Fantasy IX, we have the spell You're Not Alone, the artwork of which depicts a scene near the end of the game where Zidane is alone and in trouble, and after spending so much of the story doing things for others, is in a situation where others come and bail him out. I forget the details. Jeff will be back next week, and we'll probably discuss this briefly at the end, and he will be able to add some corrections, because while he is not a magic nerd, he has a much stronger claim to the Final Fantasy nerd mantle than I do. Jecht, Reluctant Guardian, is a powerful card, but once he transforms, he doesn't last long before he expires, which fits well with the temporary gossamer nature of the faith, or the dreams of the faith, or whatever it is that Jecht and Titus are. I realize now that Jecht is from Final Fantasy X, so I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So we'll slot him in for Final Fantasy X, but going back to 9, Queen Braun literally makes black wizards when she attacks, and Kuja, Genome Sorcerer, who is a Rakdos character, also produces black mages. And black mages, though they're shrouded humanoid figures, are not exactly organic. They're not exactly alive. They are sort of automatons that are constructed and exist for a certain amount of time and then expire. I forget the details, which really reveals how suspect my claim to Final Fantasy nerdiness is, since apparently the black mages from Final Fantasy IX, of which there is, or was for a time, a rock band led by Nobu Uematsu, the acclaimed musical genius who has done most of the scoring for the Final Fantasy series over the years and decades, that the Black Mages are among the most popular characters in all of Final Fantasy among diehard fans. And WotC did its research here, because if you had just a passing familiarity with Final Fantasy, or even if you had dabbled in some of the games when you were younger, and you were asked about which card, if a set was being made, would be the marquee, most salient, most powerful card in the set that would be most likely to potentially break certain formats and shoot up in value higher than any other card of the set, you might think it would be Sephiroth or Cloud, or at the very least the primary protagonist or the primary antagonist from a game. But that is not the case. The card that is most likely to be banned in various formats from the Final Fantasy set is none other than the ultimate black mage himself, Vivi, or Nidier. And I should have used the context clues available to me to surmise that Vivi would be so popular and powerful, given such a strong treatment in the representation of the card, because Jeff himself has a figurine of Vivi on his work desk. As far as the bannings go, they banned the most iconic card from Lord of the Rings, the one that Post Malone paid a couple $1 million for the serialized version of. They banned the One Ring from Lord of the Rings. So the idea that they wouldn't consider banning Vivi strains credulity to me. And as far as the flavor goes from representing the video game character on the card, Vivi does nothing of the sort. He is just an especially powerful Is-It spell slinger card, who, despite being a black mage, isn't even black. He's red and blue. So he's like Celes that we referenced earlier, where he provides a powerful effect in his colors, but it bears no resemblance to how the creature is portrayed, or how the character is portrayed in the video game. From Final Fantasy IX, we get Summon Bahamut, which is the most expensive casting cost summon in the set at 9 mana. And Yuna, Hope of Spira, who is the more advanced and more costly to cast version of Rydia. Though she is in Celestia colors, which is green and white, one of the things that she can reanimate is her own Aeon, Anima, whose suffering she has to relieve. Or something. My memory might be really garbled on that. Maybe my mind is errantly forging that connection because the artwork for Anima is quite stark and evocative of the ghastly representation of the Aeon in the Final Fantasy X video game. As noted earlier, there is enough material for several of these titles to stand alone as their own set, and I'd welcome that because playing the limited environment has been quite a bit of fun. It's a well-designed, intricate, balanced set, in addition to having nostalgia hit after nostalgia hit provided. My Universes Beyond Dream, though, well, Pokemon is the best-selling trading card game in the world, but the margin of difference in the United States is nothing close to what it is in Japan. In the United States, Pokemon outsells Magic the Gathering by about 2-1, whereas in Japan, it outsells Magic by a ratio of closer to 10-1. WotC has wanted to really tap into the Japanese TCG market, but has had limited success in doing so. But while Final Fantasy is the most popular turn-based RPG series, or at least initially turn-based RPG series in America, it is the second most popular in Japan. It is second to the Dragon Quest series. And so if WotC is able to kill two birds with one stone by making a Dragon Quest Universes Beyond set, I might have to drop my decades-long boycott of the company on account of my own miserliness masquerading as principled opposition to a cultural conformity to the neoliberal American zeitgeist. That'll do it for today. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.